Okay, so welcome everyone. I'm really excited to be here with my long-term colleague and friend Jason Furman to talk about US economic policy and some of its implications for the rest of the world, including Europe. So Jason, I'm so happy you are here. You probably don't realize, but this sort of fireside chat format is something we usually only do for central bank governors. So we hope this gives you a better shot of getting there sometime in your life. So Jason and I have also interacted professionally in the past, mainly when Jason was the chair of the Council of Economic Advisors at the White House in the Obama years, and he did that for a substantial period, maybe 5 years or something like that.
4 years.
4 years, and during this time, Jason was also the chair of the OECD Economic Policy Committee, which is how it works. The chair of the EPC is always a US official, usually the CEA chair, and I was a member of the EPC, and Jason organized sort of like a little peer group during that time, which I was part of. I was heading the economic policy department of the German Ministry for Economic Affairs. And our colleague Jean Pisani was also part of that as head of France Stratégie. So in retrospect, it seems like the most idyllic times in transatlantic economic relations, and we had many great discussions. So we are here to talk about US economic policy and economic events in the US. And the great thing about Jason is that, I'm sorry, I didn't really introduce him. So he is the former head of the CEA. He's professor of economic policy at both in a double appointment at the Department of Economics at Harvard University and at the Kennedy School. And before he's also a non-resident senior fellow at the Peterson Institute for International Economics, which I was also part of for some great years. And before that, Jason was an academic and also had a White House role before he became CEA head. So the great thing about Jason, and this reflects his sort of broad exposure to policy, is that you can ask him both conjunctural questions, like what's going to happen to the next payroll statement, and you can ask him longer-term questions. And let's start with a more conjunctural question, which is, it's fair to say that the first months of the Trump administration have imparted a shock to the U.S. economy. And roughly how bad do you think, at this point with the current information, is that shock? And, specifically, what is your sense of whether the U.S. economy is heading into a recession or not?
Yeah, so first of all, it's really terrific to be here. I think I was last at Bruegel this is on? Okay. Oh yeah, I think I was last at Bruegel a decade ago. And had a great conversation here back when I was in the government. And, in answer to your question, the first thing to know is almost nothing has showed up in the hard data yet. The jobs report for the month of April was perfectly spectacular. We got a below expectations inflation report yesterday. People who go through the different components can see this one was a little higher because of the tariffs and maybe attribute 3 basis points of the inflation to the tariffs, but not much. I think for the most part, you wouldn't have expected to see that much in the data for April. You'd think this is coming later. The tricky thing is if you put the tariffs themselves into just any standard macro model, goods imports are 10% of US GDP. It just isn't that important. You don't get, especially now that China trade is at least temporarily going to resume, you don't get the types of complicated supply side things. During the pandemic, if you had an F-150 truck sitting on your lot and it needed one chip to finish it and sell it to people and you couldn't get that chip, it was just going to stay on the lot. Now, if you have to pay an extra 25% for that chip, you'll pay it in order to get it there. So you put it into the standard models, and you get a decent amount of inflation, maybe 1.5 points on top of what we have right now. You don't get that much slower growth, and you certainly don't get a recession. Now, layered on top of all of this, though, is just a huge dose of uncertainty, a huge dose of pessimism. And the question there is, to what degree is that what people say, or are they actually acting on it? The consumer pessimism, I guess I've been trained for the last couple of years to just disregard it entirely, especially when Democrats went from incredibly optimistic to incredibly pessimistic. Republicans reversed. It seems like a political statement, not an economic one. With businesses, there is at least one survey that asks them, how is this affecting your investment plans? And put a number on it. How is it affecting your hiring plans? Put a number on it. And that showed, they said, about a 15% reduction, both in the rate of hiring and in the rate of investment. That would be pretty meaningful, but even that probably not enough to get you to a recession. So the final thing I'd say, just in summary, the extra inflation seems nearly certain. What happens in terms of the uncertainty demand shock is much more uncertain. And this is why the Federal Reserve is appropriately ensuring that it's going to be behind the curve, because the alternative is to be ahead of the curve, and it just doesn't know which curve it's supposed to be ahead of, and could end up ahead of the wrong curve. And that's why it's in this reactive mode.
Great. So you emphasized the potentially destructive consequences of policy uncertainty. And so, one thing we might collectively do is to figure out whether there is a method to what we have seen. And if we had figured that out, so some sort of federal government reaction function, then we would at least have dealt with the uncertainty. It would be easier to predict what will be coming next. And so I guess that many of the things that the administration has been doing the last few months were in fact predictable. They were stated, they were part of the platform. We didn't know how far the administration would go, how quickly, but we expected them. We certainly expected tariffs. We expected deportations and much tighter border controls. And these things we may or may not agree with, but they were predictable. What was not predictable was the form in which some of these policies were implemented. And so here, this is both about the extent, but it's also about the stop and go, right? So very aggressive tariffs, very aggressive border policies to be taken off, suspended, and then reinstated. And so at this point, have you figured out a policy reaction function of the administration? So is there a method behind this? Is there a strategy? And to the extent that there is, who is driving it at this point? So there is also potentially a theory that maybe in the beginning there wasn't much, but that the realization that some of these things have substantial economic costs may be disciplining the administration. And so, cooler heads may be prevailing and some sort of more systematic approach may be shaping up. Is that true? And if that is the case, who should we be focusing on other than the president himself when we try to figure out U.S. policy?
Yeah, so, the one constant of Trump's first administration and Trump's second administration is Donald Trump. He has thought for decades that trade is zero-sum, that trade deficits are evidence that other countries are taking advantage of the United States, and that tariffs can rectify this problem. That makes it puzzling as to why trade policy was so vastly different in the first term than this one. And just to put a point on it, in the first term, basically nothing happened until August of his first year, when he requested the Department of Commerce initiate a national security, Section 232 investigation of China. They spent 10 months on that investigation, and in June the following year, reported back the results, recommended a set of tariffs, and those tariffs on China went into effect 1 month after they were announced, and they applied to $35 billion worth of American imports from China. So all told, a year and a half in, you get tariffs on $35 billion of imports, all done sort of by the book, following exactly the process and rules that you're supposed to for those forms of tariffs. This time, of course, we had tariffs on Canada, Mexico, and China within weeks of his being in office. We had a full set of, you told me not to do ad hominem, but really deranged reciprocal tariffs by early...
It's still not ad hominem because it's the policies that are deranged, not the people.
Yes. And I'm really just referring to the 10% on the Penguin Island, which I think it's sort of hard to defend. And the and then the 145% tariffs on China. So just a vastly different thing this time around. For a while, people thought, he doesn't care about markets anymore, and there's no reaction function there. Then he seemed to care about the bond market. Then he seemed to care about the stock market. And now, the sort of amazing and surprising thing to me is, yes, this is the campaign platform. It still is a higher effective tariff rate than most people were betting on. If you asked investors, there were different surveys and the like, what's the average tariff rate going to be under Donald Trump? It was numbers like 7 or 8%. We started at 3, 7 or 8%. Right now, it's about 15 to 20%, depending on how you calculate it. So it's a much higher tariff than anyone expected, but markets have been pretty forgiving about it. It's almost as if the strategy of announcing something really extreme and then dial it back to something merely sort of Venezuelan and Iran level tariffs somehow is directional, and a lot of the credibility the United States has built up with its deep and liquid financial markets, the attractiveness of investment has been, notwithstanding some pronouncements that it's gone forever, much more durable and robust than someone's saying. So there's, a deep-seated belief in trade. There does still seem to be some belief in markets. The April announcement, by everything I heard, he took a harder line than any of his advisors, including Peter Navarro, that Peter Navarro thought he was going in with a bit of a extremist negotiating position to the internal debates, and the president went above Peter Navarro, and even Peter Navarro was somewhat surprised by it. And so this is a man who is very comfortable with his own views on policy. Even during his campaign, most campaigns have a policy shop, maybe 5 or 6 people, and then they draw on a lot of outside experts. He didn't have a policy shop on his campaign. He was the policy person. He had delegated, many other aspects of the campaign. So I don't think you want to look to people. I think you want to think of his changing views, and then he picks the person who has the view that he has now. And the very, very last thing I'd say about all of this is, I said he was the constant from Trump 1 to Trump 2. Everything else is both more protectionist and populist and more enabling. Certain people are the same, but they're in more empowered positions, like Stephen Miller. The chair of the Council of Economic Advisors now believes more in protectionism than the one in the first term. The National Economic Council director is more of a believer that his job is to enable and support Donald Trump rather than the National Economic Council director under the first term, which was more like hiding trade agreements so that, trade rescission so that he wouldn't sign them. And so, he's built a structure that lets him be himself, and he's not totally constant all the time.
Should I draw comfort from what you said in the sense that if Donald Trump does not feel strongly about a particular policy area, and that could include important economic policy areas, these areas are essentially going to be delegated to reasonable people, and things will be fine. And of course, the Treasury normally is not concerned either with deportations or with trade issues. So, those that are very close to the president's heart are clearly, dominated by him. But that still leaves quite a lot, right? International finance, effectively. So, would you be a bit, is that the right way to think about it? That there is a narrow perimeter, a relatively narrow perimeter. I mean, broad in its effect, but still relatively narrow, where there's a personal interest. Beyond that perimeter, we are still essentially in the world of Trump 1, where you have people who are ideologically aligned with the president, but understand how economics works and want to minimize damage for the U.S. And so we should be less concerned.
I think that's mostly right. For example, antitrust policy looks like largely a continuation of the Biden administration, in some respects for better, in some respects I think that's actually for worse, but totally normal and done in a reasonably professional manner. That's a lot of the secretaries didn't like the way that Elon Musk was interfering with them and getting in the way of what they were trying to do in their departments, and they wanted to run things in a little bit more normal manner. The most consequential policy issue outside of trade and immigration is fiscal policy. And there, the president definitely wants Congress to pass what he's calling a big, beautiful bill. There's one or two things that to him are really important in it, signature campaign promises like you wouldn't have to pay a tax on your tips. But beyond that, has had a very oddly passive approach to the whole thing. I mean, he'll even post on Truth Social, I wish you did this, but you probably won't, and that's okay too. And by the way, if you did it, the thing I wanted, the Democrats would be mean, so maybe, who knows? It's sort of letting them very much, he hasn't submitted a budget. He has a so-called skinny budget for spending priorities for some programs for this year, but for the most part, hasn't submitted a budget and has let them, go forward, pretty much unsupervised. Now, that might be a problem, though, because what they're going forward with is something that would add about $5 trillion to the debt over the next decade. And the pronouncement from the White House, we want to get the deficit down to 3% of GDP, which I think is a reasonable target, roughly what you would need to get the debt on a downward course. But there's a complete disconnect between that and the fiscal policy making going on now.
So let's stay on that topic a little bit. So you are not exactly a fiscal conservative, even though you have co-authored with fiscal conservatives. We had strong concerns about fiscal sustainability in the United States for a while. We had these concerns during the Biden administration. We seem to be heading in the wrong direction. How concerned are you at this point? Or another way of asking the question is, how close are we to something like the mini budget crisis moment in the UK in 2022? Could something like that happen in the US, and what would trigger it?
Yeah, so the mini budget proposed tax cuts that were 1.5% of GDP. The tax cuts under consideration now are basically 1.5% of GDP. Now, there's some differences. A bunch of the tax cuts now are just continuing what's already in the law, so you could argue that's not really adding to the deficit. It's just missing an opportunity to reduce the deficit. But that's a reminder that it's not like you can plug these deficits or debt into a macro model and here's how many basis points you get on the 30-year, if you're looking at gilts, for each percentage point of deficit or debt increase. That what went on in the UK was as I interpret it, is a combination of firing the career civil servant head of the Treasury, talking about taking away the independence of the Bank of England, ignoring the Office of Budget Responsibility, and just a full set of institutional signaling around all of that. Now, we have a bit of all of that, too, flirting back and forth with the Fed, which I should say, as an aside, is another one where I hear from people sort of close to the White House that this is something that he truly believes. So before it came out in public, I was hearing about how much he was talking in private about firing Jay Powell and how much he truly believed it. And every day they'd talk him out of saying something in public. But, you know, they had pretty good record, right? Like 99 days in a row. And you know, then they didn't succeed. But anyway, so you have a little bit of that in the Fed. You have a little bit of sort of not doing the analytics around all of this. But, you know, the reservoir of trust in the United States, as I said before, I mean, we have more error tolerance in policy than most countries do. I mean, part of why we can flirt with the idea of being an autarky, discuss the other topic another time, with being an autarky is that, like, you know, we could sort of still make cars and we'd have oil to put in the cars and maybe even could make computers, even if they wouldn't be quite as good as the ones we get from Asia. And same thing with our financial markets. They just have, you know, more error tolerance around them. So, you know, where are we right now in our fiscal trajectory? We have a primary deficit of about 3% of GDP. I think of thinking of, you know, the growth rate and the interest rate is roughly being equal on a going forward basis. So you roughly want to balance your primary deficit. A 3% of GDP adjustment is something that we did in 1990 plus 1993 in two budget deals, the first one bipartisan, the second one Democrats only. So it's a conceivable thing with historic precedent. It's not something, though, that we've seen the likes of for the last 30 years, and very hard to imagine the political system doing it. But, you know, in the political system's defense, you know, there's a paper by Alan Auerbach and Denny Yagan that shows it used to be when deficits went up, you did more deficit reduction. There was a very strong reaction function. For the last 25 years, there hasn't been a reaction function, and they interpreted that of, you know, everyone's gone crazy. Well, for the last 25 years, half of that time, interest rates have been at the zero lower bound. You probably shouldn't have had a reaction function. Even now, the 10-year just isn't that high. So it'd be hard for me to go to anyone and say, you know, drop everything to deal with this problem. And the question is, if those economic circumstances changed, could the political system rise to the challenge? And we don't know the answer to that.
Yes, I mean, that is, in a sense, there was a bit of an IMF-y answer to the question, because the
compliment?
That's a good thing. Yeah, because essentially the logic is that, you know, U.S. debt is sustainable as long as we think that the required adjustment is politically and economically feasible. Now, economically feasible for sure, politically feasible, the jury is out. But before I let you go on fiscal, because we both love it so much, what about the long-term issues? So I remember looking at CBO forecasts when we were both at the Peterson Institute and finding this seemingly contradictory fact that at that point we were forecasting, we were in a negative R minus G moment, so real growth was higher than real interest rates, and the CBO was actually projecting this to continue for a long time, yet the debt was projected to also rise and rise and rise, and of course the reason was aging costs, right? So even with negative R minus G, if the primary deficit keeps rising, you're going to blow the debt beyond bounds. And so in what your argument you made, you sort of tuned out that aspect. Is that because the long-term aging cost projections have changed, or because this is simply in another segment of your head where you say, oh, Social Security is something we need to deal with through structural reform, and so it's not something I'm going to worry about as part of the fiscal adjustment?
Yeah, so as I said, I think of G minus R as zero. But let's say you think of it as 1, and I did G minus R, so 1 is the good thing. That says you could have a primary deficit of 1% of GDP, given where we are in terms of the debt. And so we're 2 points away from that instead of 3 points away from that. And that would be the wildly optimistic scenario. If you look at the CBO projections, the primary deficit actually doesn't rise very much over the next, they go out just 30 years. And that's because you do have the aging. But health spending has slowed quite a lot, and they carry some of that forward. There's parts of the tax system that aren't indexed, so taxes rise as a share of GDP, and there's real bracket creep even for the parts that are indexed, because it's indexed to prices, not wages. And then you have some of the discretionary spending getting squeezed over time, which you could debate whether it is or isn't realistic. So I think this is sort of almost as much a flow problem today as it is in the future. In terms of some magnitudes, as I said, there's that 3% of GDP adjustment that I think we need to make, maybe 2% if you want to be an optimist. If you solve the Social Security, which is the old age and disability pension program, that's 1.5% of GDP if you solve that. And historically, that's always been solved. Right now, the whisper expectation is that there's some gimmick, general revenue transfer that's done rather than actually cutting benefits or raising taxes. Medicare also, part of it, the hospital part, operates on a trust fund. Solving that over 75 years, I think, is 0.2, maybe 0.3% of GDP. So those two programs dealing with the thing that you are supposed to do under the rules, where there is a political forcing event, although one, like all political forcing events that you could choose to gimmick your way through and ignore, those get you to not quite 2% of GDP. So you're going to want and need to do something outside of at least those two large entitlement programs at some point to deal with the situation.
Got it. So I'm going to move to financial matters. And so I'm going to ask you a question more on the domestic and one on the international side. So on the domestic side, clearly this is an administration that wants to give crypto a lot of latitude. It's also an administration that wants to deregulate, and there is some precedence from Trump 1 for how to do this. Again, how concerned should we be, and to what extent is the argument that as long as the Fed stays independent, there is in some sense a limit, or broadly institutions continue doing what they're supposed to do, there is a limit to what can go wrong? Or do we have, in a sense, precedents that politics and the change in political winds or ideology can influence the behavior of independent regulators and supervisors more than, say, on inflation, where there's a clear target, the precedent, of course, being SVB, and the U.S. has a track record of things occasionally going wrong because supervision was looking the wrong way, and this is before we even start talking about crypto. So for me, this is an area where, in a sense, my personal distribution of potential outcomes is particularly wide. So I could find a plausible argument to saying that concerns are exaggerated. I could also find arguments to say the opposite. So where do you see it?
So I'm confused and unsure of what I think about this topic, and let me just go through some of that confusion. The president did an executive order for a unitary executive, and it elaborated the theory that every single person who works for the executive branch is basically just doing what they're doing because the president doesn't have enough time to do it himself. But if he had enough time, he could do it himself, and it's all up to him. And that says you can't really have independent agencies making independent decisions. It's just delegated authority that he can give and take as he wishes. That order had an explicit carve-out for only one function in the entire federal government, and that was monetary policy conducted by the Federal Reserve. Regulatory policy conducted by the Federal Reserve did fall under that order, as did every other agency. So I have mixed feelings about this. There's a part of me that is a certain amount sympathetic to it. When I walked in the door in 2009, we felt like Obama had been elected on a platform of change. There were various people that were holdovers from the Bush administration and regulatory agencies, and we sort of wanted them out sooner rather than later so we could bring our policy changes in. The Federal Communications Commission is supposed to be totally independent. We had a policy on net neutrality that the president felt very strongly about, by the way, against my own recommendations, but that's neither here nor there. And what did he do? He didn't order them to do his policy. He recorded a video saying, here's the policy I would be so excited if they chose to do, released the policy on the internet, and I think a day later they had a 500-page version of that policy that they released and announced. So was that the most independent way of conducting business? Probably not. Do I think that on a key policy issue, the president should be able to make a decision on it? I actually sort of do think that. So I have a certain amount of sympathy with this. Now, where I get nervous is in three places. One is this is a president that has a rather expansive idea of his own role. And when it comes to crypto, I sort of hate and detest crypto. I think it's a solution in search of a problem. It's a scam. It's useless. It's pointless. But I'm enough of a libertarian that in some of my inclinations that I think, maybe regulators shouldn't be the ones to stop it, that they should give it a chance. I don't think it'll work out, but that the previous administration probably was too heavy-handed and went beyond the law in restraining it. But it's a very long way from give it a chance to buy your favorite coins and buy Trump coin and auction off Trump coin and the like. So he has a way of pushing a little bit past where you'd go. The second thing is I would distinguish between policy issues and enforcement issues. So if it is what should the capital requirements be, what should the supplementary leverage ratio be, absolutely I think the president should almost have a say, almost get to decide that if he wants to. Is it this particular bank over here? Are we going to shut it down or not shut it down? Much less so, especially because you get worried that if the bank lends to the Trump enterprise, it is allowed to go on, and if it doesn't, it doesn't. Same thing with antitrust. To decide the general orientation of antitrust policy, absolutely the White House should do that. To decide whether to prosecute one particular company, no. And so can you draw that line between policy and enforcement? Is this the right one to do it? And then to get back to where you started, Jeremy, I actually do think you can probably separate out financial regulation from monetary policy at the Fed. Financial regulation has a philosophical component where the parties differ in a way that monetary policy doesn't. It doesn't have the time-consistent thing where it doesn't have quite the same time-consistent as extrema manner, where everyone will want to tie their hands. So I think there's a logic to separating them. I think de facto the Fed has separated them. They were deregulatory under Trump 1, regulatory under Biden, and now they're deregulatory again. So I think you can actually have a non-unitary, the Fed defers on financial regulation and doesn't on monetary policy. But that being said, there too, when you're sort of trying to create a line within a single agency and there's overlap between policies on both sides of the line, it also makes me nervous. So the way I'd summarize what I'm saying is I think under reasonable administration, this wouldn't be a crazy direction to go. I'm not sure this is the most reasonable administration, and so I'm somewhat angsty about all of it.
Thank you. Jason. So I'm just for expectation, I have three more questions. One is on the international finance dimension. One is about sort of institutional impact and potential long-term damage. And then it's about what Europe should or can do. So on the international financial dimension, so there is one area that sits sort of right between policy areas where we know that Trump has very strong views, has held these views for a very long time, like immigration, like the idea that the US is taking advantage of both through trade and through defense. And then the other areas like antitrust, where there's essentially continuity and a lack of interest. And that is the notion that possibly the international role of the dollar might be the third front through which the US is being taken advantage of, because the dollar plays a key role, first of all, as a sort of utility in international payment system, and second, as a global safe asset. And at least, one important economist in the administration, Steve Myron, has made the argument that the rest of the world does not fairly remunerate the United States for this service, just like it does not fairly remunerate or exploits the US on trade, something we would disagree with, and like it did not fairly remunerate the US on defense, something that we would probably be more sympathetic to. So first of all, can you give your views on the merits of this argument, number one? And second, is this an area that you would expect the administration to act on? So, try and collect its fair share, so to speak, or the remuneration. Myron himself has given a few options on how it might do that at a discussion at the Hudson Institute a couple of months ago, or months ago. And so if it goes down that route, could this be, if you like, the next shoe to drop after the tariffs in, taking a confrontational view of international economic policy?
Yeah, so Steve Myron in November, when he was in the private sector, wrote a paper called A User's Guide to Restructuring the Global Financial System, something to that effect. And then his Hudson Institute speech was pretty similar to that. And I describe that as having three parts to the argument. Number one, a basically normative argument that the world is taking advantage of the United States by using the US dollar. That's not, I don't think it's crazy to say that there are costs and benefits of exorbitant privilege, the benefit being lower interest rates and ability to run a sustained current account deficit, which I think means you get more imports, and we enjoy the imports. But it does lead to structural and consistent overvaluation of the dollar. Certainly every IMF report I've ever looked at in my life has had the dollar overvalued, and that means a somewhat smaller manufacturing sector than you otherwise would have. I think that's overwhelmingly a good thing, not a bad thing, but there's some judgment about the costs and benefits. I'd have a different one than he would have. The other, by the way, benefit I should add is just a geopolitical one of just the extraordinary ability of the United States to use the role of the dollar, the American financial system, the rails, et cetera, on sanctions and other international issues. A power that's diminishing, but is still quite potent. So that was part one of the argument, was the world's taking advantage of us. Part two of the argument was, let's assume we can control the economic policies of every country in the world. And then part three was deriving from that the consequences for the United States. And part three, which was economics, I think you got it all right. I didn't really see any errors there. It was part two, where you're assuming that you can control the policies of every country. So, in some trivial sense, and he had this example in the Hudson Institute, if the United States could get every country in the world to write a check to the United States would be richer and other countries would be poorer, and I agree with that economic analysis. I'm not sure I agree with either the morality of the premise or the feasibility of the premise, but as a positive statement, if it was on my exam and it was an if-then statement, the person would be marked correct. Other ones get fancier in terms of holding debt, long-term debt, zero coupon and the like. I don't think the administration is actually serious about those. All meeting together in Mar-a-Lago to change exchange rates. I actually don't think that's where they're going. They're doing the much more country-by-country boutique approach to handling the trade issues, not bringing everyone together. Moreover, I don't think in today's world, where some of the main countries that we have currency issues with aren't U.S. allies, unlike the 1980s, when it was countries like Germany and Japan that were very close allies and places we had extensive military cooperation with. That's not the case for a country like China. Moreover, central banks are more independent now than they were in the 1980s, so it's not like Christine Lagarde is going to be party to this agreement and make the euro go in the direction that Donald Trump wants her to. So I don't think this is actually what they're trying to do. I think it's probably more of just a rationalization that can be done at one intellectual level for the zero-sumness underlying, policies that are going in a quite different direction.
Right. So before I ask you the next question, I just wanted to state, not necessarily because I want to argue with you over this, but because I promised Hélène Rey, who is the leading authority on this, to make this point whenever needed, and that is that while the general statement that the exorbitant privilege of the dollar, of the US, in being able to issue in its own currency and enjoying a low interest rate does have a counterpart, which is what they call the exorbitant duty. In their view, that exorbitant duty, or the cost, if you like, of being the reserve currency is not that it necessarily condemns you to having a current account deficit, but rather that it condemns you to taking more risk, because in every sort of financial crisis in the world, there will be a flight into the dollar, which means that the dollar will appreciate, which means that long-term assets in foreign currency that the dollar is accumulating outside are going to depreciate, right? So it's this insurance function that is the cost. And they would say that it's not true that the exorbitant privilege automatically means a current account deficit, because the counterpart to issuing dollars and having this inflow into US treasuries is, according to their data, an outflow into risky long-term assets, right? So the image they have is the US functions like a hedge fund, essentially. It takes risks, but the current account deficit is not necessarily the consequence, right? And I do think we probably agree that the US has some policy levers, such as fiscal policy, that it could use to reduce the current account deficit and still be the international reserve currency. You agree with that, right?
Yeah, I think I agree with all that. I mean, first of all, on the flight to safety, we did manage to do something about that issue over the last month, but I still think I'd bet on it as the general thing going forward, with the sort of first point I'd make. Second, yes, reserve currency status isn't necessary to run a persistent current account deficit. As long as your currency is like called the dollar, you can be like Australia and also run a persistent deficit. And I think it's not sufficient either, would be that point. But that hedge fund argument is also part of the greater risk tolerance and resilience of the U.S. economy and U.S. financial markets to problems that it itself may create. And that's part of why, for most countries, I'd say don't run a 4% of GDP current account deficit. That's a bit sort of towards the high end. But partly, on a flow basis, the income flows are still positive, or basically zero for the United States. But also, that, when the risk happens, the money doesn't come out, it comes in, so it enables you to do that. But absolutely, the last thing I'd say is, Michael Pettis, these people who sort of obsess over things other countries do to cause our macro imbalances, my view is sort of they generally tend to overstate their arguments by a factor of 4 to 10. Not totally wrong, overstate the arguments. But second of all, there's nothing you can do about that other country, like China's macro imbalances. Maybe you can do some guaranteed purchase to rearrange bilateral deficits, but their overall balance, nothing we can do. And talking about it is a substitute, not a complement, for doing the things we can do, including the fiscal steps that we were talking about before, to do something about it. And that's a common pattern around the world. Usually whenever leaders are blaming foreigners for their country's problems, that's sort of a leader who's probably done something to cause the problem themselves and doesn't want anyone to notice.
Okay, so I'm going to switch from economic stricto sensu to a sort of a more philosophical question, which is we are, of course, all concerned about longer-term damage, not just short-term damage from some of these policies. And one argument you can make is that the administration has shattered beliefs about the power of certain norms of behavior, constraints on the executive, which we didn't even realize for the most part that they were norms. Sometimes we thought they were laws, actually. Turns out they're not. Turns out, there's some arcane law that actually may suggest that what they're trying to do is legal, may or may not be true, but certainly there's been a lot of shattering of norms. And the question is really, beyond being bad in itself, it strikes me as being bad because it's hard to reverse. So I wanted you to help me think a bit about that. So one question I've asked myself for a long time, even after Trump won, was how is the US going to come back from this? And so normally the US and other countries come back from something like this, and sort of the closest analogy would be Watergate, in my view, by having a sort of a repudiation of that type of behavior by the political system, which can lead to legal changes, but it establishes, if you like, a strong new norm. And indeed, many of the norms that Trump is now violating are a product of the Watergate fallout. But if the whole point here, if the way in which misbehavior happened is the shattering of norms, how can one rebuild that confidence? And so my worry is that in the end, maybe the only way you can rebuild that is by trying to legalize too much, right? To moving away from a political system which is like a very smart incomplete contract where not everything is law, but the norms work, to something where things are codified, and of course that is going to impose a cost. So both lack of credibility, uncertainty imposes a cost, but that the attempt to repair it by substituting norms that you cannot bring back anymore because the emperor has no clothes, effectively, by laws will also cause a cost. So this is sort of a qualitative argument. It depresses me a lot because I think that maybe something that was great about the US is irreversibly gone. So no, you being a sunny person, and also you being a quantitative person, I mean, you've noticed the main difference between Jason and every other great economist is that Jason not only makes great arguments, but he backs these arguments by giving you like percentage points of GDP, right? Of to what extent does it apply or not, or orders of magnitude. It's not just Michael Pettis is wrong or right, he's wrong by a factor of 4, okay? So I'm hoping you're telling me I'm exaggerating by a factor of 20 for such and such reasons. Go.
You said I was sunny, and I think that's fair. I think I'm relatively sanguine on this, but I'm nervous that I'm overly sanguine. And it also might be the type of thing that, if you go to the doctor and you're really, really worried and they tell you you'll probably be fine, there's a 95% chance you're not going to die in the next month, that you're not going to walk out of that office feeling super duper reassured. So part of what we might be talking about is a set of risks that was 0% before and is now some number greater than 0. But let me spend a moment on the sanguine case, and I divide time into 2 intervals. One is the next 3 2/3 years, which is when he'll be president, and then the second interval is T plus 3 2/3 to infinity, which I think was where more of your question was, but they're related. There's so far, what are the possible constraints on you? One constraint is the legal system, and I have a lot of faith that the Supreme Court is going to be quite principled in evaluating presidential power, not necessarily all 9 people on the court, but the majority of the court. And we've already seen signs of that in some decisions. It's all slower than I'd like. You can do much more damage and chaos and whatever else in the interval between announcing it and stopping it. But I think ultimately a certain amount of it will be stopped. And will he obey or disobey a bright line Supreme Court order? There's a debate about the degree to which he's done that with some other lower courts already, including lower courts that were sort of backed up by the Supreme Court. So I don't have total confidence in this, but I don't know. I have a certain amount. Unpeeling, one layer further, other restraints of the markets. They've mattered some in the financials, in economic policy. Congress has not been much of a constraint so far, but it's a little bit of one. He just appointed, nominated somebody just really, really unqualified to be the prosecutor for the Washington, D.C. area, who is supportive of January 6th. And the Senate made it clear they weren't going to confirm this person, and he withdrew them. Now, he has put in an interim person that might even be worse, but that person wouldn't get it. Now, underlying all of this is the public. And here is where I've been really, really pleasantly surprised, which is that this has been extremely unpopular. And it's not just the stock market going down that's unpopular. The disappearing Abrego Garcia to El Salvador, to a prison camp there, I might have thought that was like a bright line injustice that one should talk about, but be worried that maybe the Democrats were hurting themselves politically by they care about this criminal in this other so-called criminal in this other country, and why aren't they caring about Americans? Turns out it's really, really unpopular, and the Trump administration has stopped talking about it because it's unpopular. Ignoring and bashing courts is really, really unpopular. And the trend of all presidents is that their popularity goes down over time. And, I think when you take that sort of fixed effect trend and add to it the idiosyncratic variation you're going to get from Trump, it's going to go down even faster. So why does that matter? I think it will give Congress somewhat more backbone and put them in a position where, unless they're partly repudiating him, they're worried that they're going to actually lose their elections. It gives the courts more backbone. I think they actually care the degree to which things are and aren't popular. And so that will give some constraint over the next 3 2/3 years, but then more importantly, it sets you up for what comes after. In my fantasy, we'd have the Nixon-like thing where basically everyone agreed that the behavior was wrong, everyone agreed it needed to change, and there were both a set of explicit laws plus new norms that were adopted. I don't think we'll see anything nearly as clear as that, but I don't think the next president on the Republican side is going to be running praising Donald Trump. I think he will be a liability to the Republican Party, and they'll want, in some ways, distance. So final negative thing here is, the opposite dynamic is the sort of idea that following norms makes you a sucker. And Joe Biden went much further than his predecessors had. He spent $500 billion on student loan debt relief based on a law that was written to give the president emergency power to probably do tens of thousands of dollars of student debt relief in very, very specific instances, and he made it a general class of basically everyone. He took people with term appointments that had 5-year fixed terms and fired a bunch of them. Donald Trump has then done much, much more. He fired many more people with term appointments, done much more abuse of the laws around the fiscal situation. But there is a bit of a trend here, and it's not just Donald Trump, and that would be, the thing to be on the worried side of the spectrum.
Okay, last question, and I realize we're going a bit over time. Maybe we can add a few minutes at the end to have more time for questions. So it's basically about what should Europe do, and by that I don't just mean, what should we do to defend ourselves or to minimize the spillovers from U.S. tariff policy and so forth. But, we've had a pretty good run with the U.S. for the last 80 years or so. So in some sense, we owe something also to the U.S. And, my hazy intuition is that somehow it is also our duty as a friend and ally to help, save the U.S. From itself, or at least from its misguided policies. Is there anything you think we can do, for example, in the way we react to tariffs, or in any other way, that would, ideally reconcile self-protection with nudging the U.S. back on the right track? But at the very least, it would not expand the damage by causing a rift in the relationship. I mean, these things there are trade-offs here, obviously.
Yeah, so I had long, nuanced answers to your last set of questions, but for this one, it's really simple. Just listen to Bruegel. But, if I had to venture my own amateurish thing, I don't love the language of retaliation, in trade fights, because every single thing Europe is doing economically right now with respect to tariff policy or digital taxation or antitrust or whatever it is, it's doing because it's in Europe's interest. And so changing any one of those things is going to hurt Europe and hurt the United States. Now, you can always design things to hurt the other side more than you hurt yourself, but every one of these policies is sort of shooting yourself in the foot, shooting the other side in the foot. Europe is absolutely within its rights to do that, and that's a choice that Europe needs to make. If you think that's a way that gets you to a better outcome that discourages the United States from doing the tariffs and to reduce them, then of course everyone will be better off if you do that. If not, then you're just hurting yourself. So, and hurting the United States. So I'm, as I said, I sort of open to anything on the retaliation side, but I think if I were part of the debate, I'd be in favor of narrower and more politically targeted, rather than thinking, you can sort of do things at the scale of the United States, which is, by the way, not attacking Europe. It's doing more damage to itself than it's doing to Europe through its own tariff policy. So that's sort of on that area. A second bucket, though, is I think I try to use this. There's an old phrase, never let a good crisis go to waste. And there's just a lot of things that Europe needs to do. A lot of them were in the Draghi report, for example. Defense is something Europe needed to do, and just use this as an excuse. And the nice thing about that is a bucket of things where Europe would be better off on its own terms doing them, unlike shooting itself in the foot. So using it in that type of respect. And then the last thing is, I do think grandiose, like the relationship is over types of statements and types of sentiments are just a mistake. I think they make things worse over the next couple of years. Donald Trump is to some degree handleable and flatterable, and I'd recommend anyone meeting with him in the Oval Office, don't give on core principles. Don't offer to sell him Canada. Make it super clear Canada's not for sale, but do it with a smile and be charming about it, and try to walk out of that room in the way that Mark Carney did, I think with complete dignity, but not really upsetting the somewhat, the occupant of the Oval Office. And, I'd sort of give that advice to others too.
Completely agreed on both on what you said about Carney and on the general principle. Okay, questions, please. So we have a few online, but we will give the floor. Okay, we have Heather and Lucio. Anyone who's not Bruegel, possibly. There's exactly Friedrich. So let's start with Heather, please. We are going to collect, which also gives you the option then of ignoring some questions if you so desire.
You can pick and choose. So Heather Gravy from Bruegel. On particularly bad news days for Europeans, we comfort ourselves with the idea that the bond markets will provide the ultimate hard constraint on Trump's behavior. But he quite shrugged off the turbulence in early April. Is he worried about the major changes in holdings, in currency holdings, and particularly the treatment of U.S. Treasuries by the markets, or is it something he thinks he can ride out?
Thank you, Friedrich. Actually, that's fine. Let's do this order.
Lucio Penck, Bruegel, just trying to put together many of the things that you said about the macro, about the risk of policy uncertainty, erosion of norms, which, and given that you like to give numbers as we had, which kind of effect would you think all this may have on the long-term growth trajectory of the United States? as opposed to the result that you get from the macroeconomic models on the effect of tariffs on inflation and the cycle.
Right, and Friedrich, look, okay, let's do 4, yeah. Friedrich, go first, and then Carrie.
Thanks a lot. Friedrich Lucke from the European Commission. You talked about a lot of different aspects of US policy, monetary, financial, fiscal, trade policy. And when I try to think through most of those, it always seems like Europe, as a consequence of those policies, could end up under the wheels of the US. Is there anything that would give the Europeans hope that turmoil that the US causes, whether it's on trade policy or on monetary policy, a potential loss of the reserve currency status, would actually benefit Europe rather than throw it under the bus even more?
Right, and finally, Carrie, here. Introduce yourself, please.
Rory McRae from Fortescue, Australian mining and energy company. There's a couple of interesting articles in the FT recently, one saying that the US have put pressure on the UK conditionality on its relations with China, and also that the US is maybe looking to tie in future countries and supply chains to fossil fuels, and that China is doing the opposite on clean energy. Given that Europe is looking to decarbonize and trying to build clean value chains with the rest of the world, what do you think the effects are, notwithstanding what Trump said about the purpose of the EU?
Thank you, Rory. Back to you, Jason.
Great. So I'm a real positive sum person, so I don't think anyone benefits from this. In the latest IMF WEO, the only country whose growth they upgraded was Spain, and I think that is because implicitly there was only a small negative because there's not a lot of trade with the United States, and then other factors totally unrelated to this outweighed this. So I think you're talking about allocating the losses, not anyone benefiting. And in terms of the long-term growth trajectory, I'm probably more worried about immigration than anything else. I am somewhat worried about, and this could be, my lobbying for my own industry, the treatment of our universities, although that's very closely related to immigration, but it's also related to the funding for them. And then trade, I think, matters for immigration. Specialization helps you advance knowledge. I think competition that trade brings does it. There's spillovers and learning and the like. It is the case, though, whenever you sort of quantify anything, it's always sort of smaller than you think. So if I were doing a 20-year potential growth forecast, I don't know, maybe I'd take it down by 1/10 a year. And that's quite a lot in the grand scheme of the world. The difference between the United States and Argentina over the last 125 years is 0.7%, 70 basis points. And so if it's sort of 1/10 of the way to like the worst way you could think of running or not quite the worst, like Venezuela's worse, but quite bad way to run an economy and society. 1/7 of the way to that's pretty bad, but it's still like 1/10. And by the way, that's still a world where I would expect productivity growth and especially overall economic growth to be faster in the United States than Europe. And by the way, some of that 1/10 comes from innovation, which maybe a few talented people show up in Europe because we don't have them in the United States. But I think more it's like ideas that don't happen. And so it lowers everyone's growth. The bond market, Heather, I thought he cared about the stock market, not the bond market. And then for a moment, he seemed to care about the bond market. And then he seemed to care about the stock market again. And so there is some feedback loop from these markets to his behavior, but it's sort of variable which market it is and how much it needs to move in order to get that feedback. But he does want to keep the status of the dollar and, in fact, has threatened countries that get rid of it. So I don't think this is a plan to dethrone the dollar. And then finally, on energy policy, I think the deregulation that he's done on the fossil fuel side is moving in the right direction. The ending the ban on new permits for LNG exports, I think was the right thing to do. The problem is he's not being all of the above when it comes to wind and solar. And, you know, I could get the argument that you don't want to subsidize wind and solar, but the idea that you'd want to actively put obstacles in the way through permitting and other mechanisms, I don't get that at all. So in some sense, I'm looking for an all of the above energy strategy president, and you know, neither the last one nor the current one have been that. But it does make it easier for this administration to deal with China. The last one, there sort of was from an environmental perspective, you wanted the cheap Chinese efficiency stuff. From a maybe national security, industrial policy, zero sum, you know, whatever it was, you didn't want that. Largely, that second camp was increasingly winning by the end over the first camp. But here, it's sort of, from their perspective, win-win. You like make green power more expensive and you hurt China, and both of those are good.
Is there a final question? No. So, thank you so much, Jason. It's been fantastic. We actually had one geek. Okay, give us a one-line answer here from the. What explains the negative GDP growth number for Q1 if there's no significant change in so many other indicators? So, geeky Jason Furman question.
I think that number was most likely mismeasured. And the core of the mismeasurement is the different parts of GDP are measured in different ways. So there's a guy at the port and he sees 100 cars come in. Those 100 cars should show up in consumer spending, inventories, or business investment, but the people counting those end up only counting 60 cars, and the whole thing doesn't add up in the way it's supposed to. And I think that was the main thing, was genuine mismeasurement. I think there's some other sort of temporary noise in reality and shifting, and whatever it was, I'd place very little weight on it.
Great. So I'm so sorry to end this fantastic conversation on the mismeasurement of a short-term indicator, but we will remember you for the medium and long-term stuff, and you give us plenty of food for thought. Thank you, Jason.
Thank you.